do it.
I'm Mark, and I'm doing. Right now, I'm talking about Unit 1, which we made the Earth. Unit 1 is global tapestries.
Wait, hold on. But before he starts, I want to specify that our theme for this project is control and influence. So remember that. It's control and influence.
Control and influence, bingo, yes. Alright, so Unit 1 is global tapestries. In the period 1200 to 1450, a vast amount of political change occurred. For instance, the Sung dynasty formed imperial bureaucracy, whatever, where the government would be able to more efficiently manage their lands like never before. They also adopted Neo-Confucianism as the state religion, as it was a revival of Confucius' religion of old, and it put large emphasis on social hierarchies it put large emphasis on social hierarchies with the state at the very top. Then in the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate, unlike the Sung dynasty, lost significant amount of influence over the Middle East and its empire as a whole due to much Turkish influence over its military. From this period, the ethnically Arab peoples of the Middle East would be ruled over by Turkish peoples for hundreds of years. This period would go on to mark the death of the Islamic Golden Age and the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate.
I'm Weston. I did Unit 2, which is about the global tapestry. Unit 2 focused on largely on the expansion of trade routes, and the expansion of these trade routes in turn led to significant shifts of influence towards and away from various states and cultures. For instance, the development of the Trans-Foreign trade route led to Islam being spread along the Saharan desert, eventually to West Africa. An empire worth mentioning during this time is the Mongol Empire.
Project your voice.
Project your voice.
Okay. Mongol Empire, which expanded into China, modern-day Russia, and even the Middle East. The Mongols, however, though they were good soldiers, did not prove to be good administrators, and their uncompromising attitude towards foreign cultures was ultimately large contributors to why the Mongols couldn't hold onto power for very long, and fragmented shortly after they came into existence. The Silk Roads were also a noticeable site of cultural exchange at this time. This made evident by the transfer of Hindu ideology from India to China. Yeah.
Alright, I'm Nick. I'm talking about Unit 3, which is land-based empires. So, in this period, the Ottoman Empire, it was formed, I believe, along the coasts of what we now consider to be like the Arabian Strait. And because of their early usage of gunpowder, they were able to expand very quickly to the point where they were actually able to conquer practically all of the Middle East and bring down the walls of Constantinople, and then subsequently march into the Balkans. From there, the Ottoman Empire's ability to coexist with its largely Christian Balkan subjects was one of the many factors that allowed the Ottomans to thrive in the period of 1450 to 1750. Now, the Ottomans weren't the only country that did mass expansion at this point, as the Mongol Empire had by this point almost completely died. The Russian state, which by this point only encompassed Moscow, very quickly expanded into much of Central Asia, and then at some point nearly all of Siberia. They were able to do this through they were able to maintain power through various westernization programs, which both Europeanized their culture as well as streamlined their government and made it more efficient. Now, in China, the Ming dynasty, having retaken the lands from the Mongols, tried to re-centralize power towards Confucian, Chinese, Han values. Unfortunately, it collapsed pretty quickly, so it didn't really matter. What came after that was the Qing dynasty. The Qing was ruled by the Manchus, which meant that it was a foreign dynasty. But the Manchus ruled through Chinese culture. So they validated themselves via the very same Confucian principles which the previous dynasties validated themselves by, as well as by the concepts of the mandate of heaven. Another thing that the Qing did was they expanded northwards, also towards Central Asia and Siberia. Now, because the Qing themselves were a foreign empire, the places that they expanded into, Mongolia, Tibet, and what we now know as Uyghurstan, underwent very little in the way of forced scenification, and were largely allowed to live on their own terms, provided that they paid tribute to the empire. This makes sense on account of the fact that the Qing themselves were fundamentally not a Chinese empire, and were instead foreigners. That's number 3.
All right. We have Unit 4. We got Mars right here, Unit 4. Unit 4 is about transoceanic interconnection. What? Just trying to copy me. The discovery of the New World in the 15th century led to a very unique period of history in both Europe and the Americas. One of the things that made colonization of the Americas so unique was the fact of when the Europeans came to the Americas, they brought diseases that basically killed the Native Americans in mass numbers. This in turn allowed Europeans to strong-arm the entire New World with relatively few roadblocks, and whatever Native Americans were left after the killing were forced to convert to Christianity and were largely enslaved. They were forced to work in a variety of plantations set up in the New World. Few times have foreign empires been able to dominate land as large and as prosperous as the New World before or since. Europe, total and oftentimes corporatist administration of the New World is an undeniable testament to what empire looks like at its coldest. The importation of African slaves to the New World was capable of influencing natives' culture to a new degree and progressing culture in the Americas in total.
Unit 5 is about the revolutions, and between the years of 1700 through 1990, a variety of revolutions happened. These revolutions could be divided into 2 categories. One of them is armed revolt against foreign oppressors. This happened largely in the Americas, Africa, and China, and ultimately weakened the European power. Oh my God. European power and productivity of Central Europe, often championed Enlightenment ideals, and as a result, often harmed monarchists, and imperialist political frameworks such as France, building tensions between the peasantry and the aristocracy led to armed revolt. And a subsequent change in French believers, like regarding universal equality, both domestic revolutions and anti-imperial revolt served to weaken the power and influence of entrenched elites.
Oh, and one more thing about the Unit 3 land-based empires. The expansion of the Chinese northwards and the Russians eastwards, that's also what marked like the kind of end of Siberia existing as like a lawless place. And from then on, like Central Asia was basically forever under the rule of somebody. Anyway, Unit, which one am I now? 5?
No.
No, we just did 5.
Yeah, you just did 5. We're on
Oh.
Unit 6, which I would really like to point out that Unit 6 is the planet Uranus, so I thought that was funny.
Yeah, Unit
Go ahead.
6, industrialization and its consequences. So, Europe industrialized around the 1800s, starting in England and then transferring over to the rest of Europe. This saw Europe possess a insurmountable advantage over the rest of the world, to the point where European colonialism was able to get kicked into high gear, as the Europeans were now strong enough to colonize nearly the entirety of the world. But also, industrialization was so demanding in resources that the only way for Europeans to maintain their industrial strength was through colonization. This then went on to cause a significant shift in the balance of power, from being somewhat in Europe's favor to almost entirely in Europe's favor, to the point where I would argue that the industrialization of Europe is probably one of, if not the biggest contributor to the scramble for Africa and subsequent colonization of much of the Third World.
Alright, Unit 7.
All right,
Unit
now
7.
we are on to Unit 7. Right there. Very beautiful. We're going to be mainly focusing on the World Wars, actually entirely. So World War I, basically it started because of imperial ambition between the Germans, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. They wanted power and they wanted control over, the British and the French and the Russians. This created a snowball effect when a Serbian assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand. This led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia.
Hey, I'm in frame, right?
Yeah, you're in front.
Okay.
Declaring war on Serbia. Then Serbia said, hey, Russia, get in on this. And then Germany came in, and then that brought Britain, and then the Ottoman, and then France. And that just snowballed basically into World War I. And then after World War I was over, they created and signed the Treaty of Versailles, which basically made Germany responsible for paying back, all the money for the war because they did the most amount of damage. And this was a very big factor into Germany's Great Depression. This Great Depression led to the rise of Adolf Hitler into power. One of the things he used was the embarrassment that patriots of Germany felt from how wrongly they were treated by this treaty, which then led to the Nazi Party, which then led to Hitler starting his military conquest, trying to create a world structure where the Axis powers were at the top, while also believing in racial supremacy, where the white people were also at the top. And that's Unit 7. So.
Now we're on Unit 8, which is about Cold War and decolonization. After the events of World War II, Europe had, for the first time in centuries, ceased to be the head of world order. And as a result of their newfound military weakness and the last Europe could no longer stand up to the influence of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, both of whom were ostensibly anti-imperialist. Europe was forced to almost completely decolonize, though this did mark the death of colonialism, imperialism.
Okay.
All right, hey, grammar Nazi, that was in my unit.
Okay.
Was still rampant through the Cold War, with both the Soviet Union and the U.S. undermining the governments of smaller and very large shift in both the way that countries were able to conduct themselves domestically and in terms of foreign
I think you skipped the line
policy.
there.
Huh?
I think you skipped the line there.
Yeah, well, now you're really just ruining it.
Okay, whatever. Yeah, fine. Keep
It
going.
was far from the end of imperialist thinking in both Eastern and Western government.
Okay, cool. So my turn. My unit, the final unit, is about globalization, 1900 onward. This is 9. And so globalization was basically, it's a result of things like televisions, radios, as well as more people being literate than they previously had. All of this contributed to information traveling basically across the globe and information went much further and faster than it had ever gone. This led to globalization. Globalization did a few things. It was responsible for widespread anti-imperialist sentiment, which in turn was a great contributor to the end of colonialism. It contributed a lot towards it contributed a lot towards the establishment of liberal democracies as being like the standard form of government. Like political thinking became very universal, or close to it, especially through the establishment of things like the United Nations. It also led to significant amounts of mutual cultural influence. And this, because after World War II, America saw a significant expansion of its film industry, led to a process that is now deemed Americanization, wherein a lot of non-American countries ingested large amounts of American media, because that was the only media that they had, and as a result became more American culturally. So yeah, that sucks, huh?
You mean the greatest thing that ever happened?
Okay, yeah, whatever then. So yeah, that's it.
America's
We're
great.
done.
All right.
Imagine it wasn't recording.
Okay, hold on. Let's just get